All right, well, this morning we are starting something new in our sermon series as well. We have finished our journey through the New Testament. How many of you actually finished your reading through the New Testament? Okay, good number of you. How many still plan to finish your reading through the New Testament? All right, a few more. Well, good. Well, we're done with our sermon series through that. And today, if you are joining into the Psalms devotionals, today would be your first day in reading in the Psalms. So make sure you're ready to go for that. And again, if you still want to get a book, let me know, although it will take a little while to get it for you. But today we are going to begin a study of the book of Judges. So if you'll turn there with me, we're going to start in chapter 1. We're going back to a more traditional, or more traditional for me anyway, study of an entire book as we work our way through it. And the book of Judges is one that I've always enjoyed reading and studying because there's so many interesting things going on there. And it's actually a book that I think a lot of folks get a little bit tripped up on because they're not quite sure what to make of some of the things that they read there. You read things and you're like, how's that good? Or what am I supposed to think of this section? I don't know what to read. And so sometimes you hear folks say that everything that anyone does in the book of Judges must be good because they're the hero, right? They're the one. So we must interpret it in such a way that everything they did was right. Or you get the opposite. Some say, well, everything they did was bad, and we have to understand that they're not a hero at all, but they're kind of the anti-hero. And so sometimes you get that type of interpretation where you almost throw everything out the window. Turn this monitor off. I think that's the problem. So you get this anti-hero mentality where they're just always wrong about everything. Well, the book of Judges, I believe, is more of a mixed bag. What we're reading about is people who are heavily influenced by the culture around them. And so even while they're doing maybe what they should do in some instances, in other instances they're not. Or even when they're doing some things, it's tainted by worldliness. So there's a lot of things going on in Judges where we read it and we're surprised because it's not necessarily godly. It's not necessarily what God would desire from them, even if it accomplishes, in the end, the goal. Often when we read this, we have to understand that there's a mixed bag of what's going on. In fact, the entire book of Judges can be summarized by the very last verse of the book, what we read in Judges 21:25. It says, "In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes." Now, this is the summation of what's happening in the book of Judges. Everyone doing what is right in their own eyes. So when we get to the end of Judges and we read that verse, we have to ask the question, well, how did they get to that point where they were just doing what was right in their own eyes? How did they wind up there? Well, this is what the book is going to explain to us, how they got to that point in their lives. So we get a lot of the background information right in chapter 1. And we'll look at this in just a moment. But understand that as we get to Judges chapter 1, this is a time of great transition in the life of the Israelites. And we all know that transitions can be difficult at times. I'm certain that many of us have gone through great transitions in our life, whether it's a change of job, a change of schools, a change of moving to a new location, whatever. But a transition can be hard. It can be overwhelming at times. I know for us, like we moved here, it's almost 2 years ago now, and we still have boxes that we haven't unpacked. And our house is still kind of in disarray. We're trying to get settled, and it feels like we're still in this transitional phase where we're trying to get everything the way we want it, and it's this constant struggle. But what do we have? What happens over time? You kind of just settle, right? At the beginning, during that beginning stage, you're on it. You want to get boxes unpacked. You want to get things put away. and you want to get things organized in the way you want them, but after time you kind of run out of energy, and the boxes are still sitting there, and things are still kind of in disarray. And we do that in our lives often. And we see this maybe what's going on in the nation as well, or this new nation that's being established. That during this time of transition, they kind of start off, and then things kind of just settle. We're kind of just tired. We're just going to leave it at it's good enough. But it comes back, and it can be a problem down the road. But let's look at what I mean by a time of transition. When we get to Judges 1:1, look what it says here. It says, after the death of Joshua, the people of Israel inquired of the Lord, who shall go up first for us against the Canaanites to fight against them? So here we have it. It starts off right away, very first verse, after the death of Joshua. Now remember, Joshua is the one who has been their leader for many years now. Remember, they had come into, Moses had led them across the wilderness for 40 years. They had come to the edge of the promised land. But before they had entered into Canaan, Moses had died. God had told him, you will not enter into the promised land. You'll see it from afar, but you won't be able to go in. So Moses had died, and Joshua had become the leader. And Joshua led them into the promised land. They had, in many ways, had conquered the land. They had overcome the enemies. They had taken the land. But there's still some things now that have to be done. They still haven't. They've divided the land amongst the tribes. They know where the tribal allotments are. But the tribes now need to go into their areas and kind of finalize everything. Finish pushing out the Canaanites and take the land for themselves and settle the land. It's interesting because Judges starts the exact same way that the book of Joshua starts, except there it says after the death of Moses, and then Joshua becomes the leader. But now we see it's after the death of Joshua. And we're left asking the question, what is going to happen with the Israelites in this time of transition? How will they handle this? After all, both of these men, Moses and Joshua, were great leaders of the people. Again, Moses had led them out of Egypt. He had brought them all the way to the edge of the promised land and then died. Joshua had led them in establishing their foothold in the promised land, and now he's dead. And now what will happen to the people? Who's going to lead them? How are they going to fare in this land? Well, we mentioned that the conquest went pretty well under Joshua. They went in, they forced the people out of the land for the most part. They had divided the land, and now each tribe again has to go into its own territory and finish the job. So what happens? This is what we're picking up with. What happens during this transition? It says, after the death of Joshua, the people of Israel inquired of the Lord, who shall go up first for us against the Canaanites to fight against them? The Lord said, Judah shall go up. Behold, I have given the land into his hand. Judah said to Simeon, his brother, come up with me into the territory allotted to me, that we may fight against the Canaanites. And I likewise will go with you into the territory allotted to you. So Simeon went with him. Then Judah went up, and the Lord gave the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hand, and they defeated 10,000 of them at Bezek. They found Adoni-Bezek at Bezek and fought against him and defeated the Canaanites and the Perizzites. Adoni-Bezek fled, but they pursued him and caught him and cut off his thumbs and his big toes. And Adoni-Bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and their big toes cut off used to pick up scraps under my table. As I have done, so God has repaid me. And they brought him to Jerusalem, and he died there. And the men of Judah fought against Jerusalem and captured it and struck it with the edge of the sword and set the city on fire. And afterward the men of Judah went down to fight against the Canaanites who lived in the hill country, in the Negeb and in the lowland. And Judah went against the Canaanites who lived in Hebron. Now the name of Hebron was formerly Kiriath Arba. And they defeated Sheshai and Ahiman and Talmai. So when we read this first section, we read this and we're like, they got off to a pretty good start here. I mean, it says right at the very beginning that the people inquired of the Lord. This is a great thing. After the death of Joshua, the people inquired of the Lord, who shall go for us? Who shall go up first for us against the Canaanites? So it's good. We see them going to the Lord and asking, what shall we do now? And so it's interesting that the Lord says Judah will go up first for you. It's interesting because we know later that the tribe of Judah will be the tribe that our Messiah would come from. So it's interesting to hear we see that Judah, the tribe of Christ, would be the one who would lead the nation going up first for them. It's also interesting that we see that Judah and Simeon are working together. This may seem like a small thing as we read it, that Judah and Simeon had formed this partnership to go in and help one another establish their areas. But this is a big theme in the book of Judges. In fact, later as we read the book, we will see that there's quite a division between the different tribes. And at the end of the book, what we see is we find there's this thing that happens. We'll discuss it more as we get there, but there's this thing that happens that causes this man to cut up a woman and mail her pieces to each tribe. And basically say, how did we get this way? How did it come to this? Talking about the division amongst the people, amongst the tribes. And so this idea of working together that we see here at the beginning is a good thing, because later in the book we see quite a divisive spirit amongst the tribes of Israel. But again, we'll talk about that more as we get there. But now we see them working together. Again, a good thing. And it says here that the Lord gave, verse 4, as they go out together, Simeon and Judah, it says, verse 4, the Lord went up, or then Judah went up, and the Lord gave the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hand, and they defeated 10,000 of them at Bezek. The Lord gave them. Notice that the God is there fighting alongside them. It's God who is there to give them success in what they're doing. Again, this is another major theme in the book of Judges that we're being introduced to here, that we're going to see come up again and again. This statement that I read earlier about the last line of the book of Judges, where it talks about there was no king in Israel. But is that true? That there is no king in Israel? See, Israel, the problem was Israel will say, we want a king like all the other nations. But the thing is, they weren't supposed to be like all the other nations. They were supposed to be unique, different. And God was their king. So there was a king in Israel. It's just that they weren't listening to their king. They weren't acknowledging their king. So they were just doing what was right in their own eyes. This reminds us of the words that we find in Joshua chapter 23 as we get to the end of the book previous to Judges here. It says there, but you shall cling to the Lord your God, just as you have done to this day. For the Lord has driven out before you great and strong nations, and as for you, no man has been able to stand before you to this day. One man of you puts to flight 1,000, since it is the Lord your God who fights for you, just as he promised you. So we see here as Judah and Simeon go out together, the Lord is with them, and he's giving them victory. He's fighting for them. And so it says here they defeated 10,000 of them at Bezek, and they found Adonai-Bezek at Bezek and fought against him and defeated the Canaanites and the Perizzites. Mentioned here Adonai-Bezek. This is an interesting phrase here. In my Bible, and I think pretty much every Bible I've looked at, the English versions write this down as if it's his name. Adonai-Bezek, as if that's what his name was. It's probably not his name. It's a title. Adonai means Lord, and Bezek is where he's from. So it's the Lord of Bezek. It's probably not his name. It's a title. So they found the Lord of Bezek, and it It says here, they found the Lord of Bezek and fought against him and defeated the Canaanites and the Perizzites. And the Lord of Bezek fled, but they pursued him and caught him and cut off his thumbs and his big toes. And Adonai-Bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and their big toes cut off used to pick up scraps under my table, as I have done. So God has repaid me. And they brought him to Jerusalem, and he died there. It says there that they cut off his thumbs and his big toes. Now, many skeptics will criticize portions of the Bible like this, here in Judges and elsewhere, in Joshua, the conquest of the land, and how the people went in and they killed lots of people and they drove them out of the land, and they basically say, how could a good God command such a thing? How could that be seen as good? Scripture makes it plain here that God was just. He was right in commanding this. He's a just judge. Deuteronomy chapter 9 says these words. We must put this in the context of what is going on here and why God allows or commands this to take place. He says, Deuteronomy 9, 4 through 6 says, do not say in your heart, after the Lord your God has thrust them out before you, it is because of my righteousness that the Lord has brought me in to possess this land, whereas it is because of the wickedness of these nations that the Lord is driving them out before you. Notice that. There is a wickedness that God has said that is present in these nations, and they are being judged for it. Not because of your righteousness or the uprightness of your heart are you going in to possess their land, but because of the wickedness of these nations, the Lord your God is driving them out from before you, and that he may confirm the word that the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Know therefore that the Lord your God has not given you this good land to possess because of your righteousness, for you are a stubborn people. Now later in Deuteronomy, we get a little bit more details about what kind of wickedness we're talking about. What is present among these nations? In Deuteronomy 18, verses 9 through 14, we read these words. When you come into the land that the Lord your God has given you, you shall not learn to follow the abominable practices of those nations. There shall not be found among you anyone who burns his son or his daughter as an offering, anyone who practices divination or tells fortunes or interprets omens, or a sorcerer or a charmer or a medium, or a necromancer, or one who inquires of the dead. For whoever does these things is an abomination to the Lord. And because of these abominations, the Lord your God is driving them out before you. You shall be blameless before the Lord your God. For these nations which you're about to dispossess, listen to fortune tellers and to diviners. But as for you, the Lord your God has not allowed you to do this. So we get this list of the wickedness that's present there. It's not an exhaustive list, but it's some of the major sins of the people. And so God, in his just judgment, has said, I am sending you in as my instrument of judgment against these nations for their wickedness. So God is just to judge. And that's exactly what he's doing with these Canaanites. He is judging them. And Israel is the instrument which he is using as judgment at this time. We see that even the Adonai-Bezek, the Lord of Bezek, affirms this. Look what he says. It says here in verse 6, Adonai-Bezek fled, but they pursued him and caught him and cut off his thumbs and his big toes. He doesn't say, what wickedness, this is not fair. Look what he says in verse 7. And Adonai-Bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and their big toes cut off used to pick up scraps under my table. As I have done, so God has repaid me. Adonai-Bezek even said, God has repaid me for my wickedness. He is just. He is right in what he has done. So even the one who is suffering here says, I've gotten what I deserve from God. So those who stand back and say, oh, how could God allow such a thing? We have to understand that God is a just judge, and he is allowed in his being the creator and the Holy One to judge sin. And that's exactly what we are reading here. But as we read this, there's some things here that are concerning. Let me finish off. Actually, I did read that in verse 10. There's some things concerning here. Even though we say they got off to a good start here, they sought the Lord, they went out together, and they had success. The Lord was with them. They were able to do all these things. There are a couple things here that are concerning. Remember how I said there's a mixed bag? There's some things here that are concerning right from the get-go. And so if we look at the details, the first thing we notice is, why did they allow Adonai-Bezek to survive at all? God told them to not allow anyone to remain in the land. Why did they take him as prisoner? That was not what the intention was. The second thing is this. Why are they treating Adonai-Bezek the same as Adonai-Bezek treated his enemy? Seems like they're just taking a page out of the Canaanite playbook, cutting off the thumbs and the toes. Is that something that where did they pick that up from? So they took him as prisoner, and they treated him just as he treated others. So that's concerning. They're acting like Canaanites in the way that they're treating this Lord of Bezek. Again, this will become more apparent as we continue to go just through this chapter, but also as we continue to go through the book. So while we can look at this as justice, getting what you deserve, it's concerning that the Israelites are acting no different than those around them. But we come into this interesting little section here, verse 11 through 15, and it talks about Caleb. It says, from there they went against the inhabitants of Debir. The name of Debir was formerly Kiriath-Sefer. And Caleb said, he who attacks Kiriath-Sefer and captures it, I will give him Achsah, my daughter, for a wife. And Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, captured it. And he gave him Achsah, his daughter, for a wife. When she came to him, she urged him to ask her father for a field, and she dismounted from her donkey, and Caleb said to her, what do you want? And she said to him, give me a blessing. Since you have set me in the land of the Negeb, give me also the springs of water. And Caleb gave her the upper springs and the lower springs. This seems like a little strange kind of interlude here in the midst of this conquest account. What exactly are we to learn from this? First, we remember Caleb. Caleb was one of the two spies sent out previously when it was Caleb and Joshua who were sent into the land amongst the spies, and they came back with a good report while the 10 others said, no, it's too scary for us to go in. We can't do that. Caleb and Joshua said, let's go. God has given us this land. Let's go take it. So Caleb and Joshua were set up in contrast to the 10 others, but Caleb and Joshua were set up as great men of faith. But what do we see here? Again, this is a strange thing where Caleb promises to give his daughter to the one who would attack this Kiriath-Sefer and capture it. And so we see that actually take place. It mentions here that Othniel, the son of Kenaz, did this, and so Caleb gave his daughter as a wife here. Again, kind of odd for us because it's so different than what we're used to. This isn't how we arrange relationships and how things happen today. So how do we take this? What is Caleb being presented as here? I want to challenge you to think of it this. Caleb is always presented in a positive light. And here he is being presented in a positive light as well. Caleb is being presented as a father who cares deeply for his daughter and her welfare. He doesn't give her to just any man. He gives her to a hero, a courageous man. And not only that, but when she is in need, he gives her also. He gives her the land to settle in. And he gives her, when she comes and says, look, I got the land, but I need water, he not only gives her the upper springs, but the lower springs as well. He gives her beyond what she requires. Caleb is being pictured here as the ideal father figure here, who cares deeply about his daughter. Again, this will come up later in the book of Judges as it contrasts some who didn't act so wonderful as fathers. In fact, we find a father who gives away his daughter to strangers to be raped. Caleb is not that kind of father. Caleb is a model father in this section, even if it seems strange to us. This is a different kind of arrangement than we're used to, but Caleb is being pictured as the model father here. But from here, things get bad. We get into verse 16, and it says, "In the descendants of the Kenite, Moses' father-in-law went up with the people of Judah from the city of palms into the wilderness of Judah, which lies in the Negeb near Arad. And they went and settled with the people. And Judah went with Simeon his brother, and they defeated the Canaanites who inhabited Zaphath and devoted it to destruction. So the name of the city was Hormah. Judah also captured Gaza with its territory, and Ashkelon with its territory, and Ekron with its territory. And the Lord was with Judah, and he took possession of the hill country, but he could not drive out the inhabitants of the plain, because they had chariots of iron. And Hebron was given to Caleb, as Moses had said, and he drove out from it the 3 sons of Anak. But the people of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem. So the Jebusites have lived with the people of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day. The house of Joseph also went up against Bethel, and the Lord was with them. And the house of Joseph scouted out Bethel. Now the name of the city was formerly Luz. And the spies saw a man coming out of the city, and they said to him, "Please show us the way into the city, and we will deal kindly with you." And he showed them the way into the city, and they struck the city with the edge of the sword. But they let the man and all his family go. And the man went to the city of the Hittites and built a city and called its name Luz. That is its name to this day. Notice here, and so it continues into the conquest or the establishment of the tribes, and we get to verse 16, and it says, "And that which they settled with the people." This is not what God intended. They were not to settle with the people. And then in verse 19, we read that they could not drive out. It says in verse 19, "And the Lord was with Judah, and he took possession of the hill country, but he could not drive out the inhabitants of the plain because they had chariots of iron." We read that, and they're like, "Oh, well, they had chariots of iron. That explains it." Well, how could they possibly conquer chariots of iron? Well, it gives us the answer right there. The Lord was with them. The Lord was with them. There was no reason that they couldn't defeat them. How could they possibly stand up to chariots of iron, right? We see something similar as we read in the verses 22 to 26 when we read about Joseph. It says, "The house of Joseph also went up against Bethel, and the Lord was with them. And the house of Joseph scouted out Bethel. Now the name of the city was formerly Luz." And so they sent out spies again to figure out how they could get into the city. Now they weren't looking for the main road. That would have been obvious. They were looking for a secret passage into the city, because cities were, during wartime, would become fortresses. You would keep people out. You would lock it down, and no one could come in or out. That was how what cities were built to be. So they were looking for, how do we get into this city so we can defeat it? Not by the main road, because that was closed, but there's got to be an entryway in and out. And so they sent out spies to figure out, how do we get into this city? Verse 24, "And the spies saw a man coming out of the city, and they said to him, 'Please show us the way into the city, and we will deal kindly with you.' And he showed them the way into the city, and they struck the city with the edge of the sword, but they let the man and all his family go." So this kind of reminds us of when the spies were sent out, and they're welcomed by Rahab, right? And Rahab welcomed them and then protected them, sent them away as she protected them from those who were searching for them. And the spies let Rahab live, and all was well. But here, this is actually a bad thing. This is being pictured as a bad thing. Notice what it says here. They let this man and his family go, and what does the man do? He goes and he rebuilds the city of Luz, the Canaanite city. because they let him go. They should not have let him go. So why was it good to let Rahab go, but not so good to let this man go? Well, if you remember the story of Rahab, what did Rahab do in the midst of all this? She professed who God was, the Lord of heaven and earth. There's no profession here. This man is not someone who has converted to following Yahweh. This is what Rahab had done. She had become a follower of Yahweh. This is why she protected the spies. But this man was just a Canaanite, a follower of other gods. And they let him go, and he rebuilds the city of Luz. And that's its name to this day, it tells us. Well, as we continue to read here, it gets worse. When we get to verse 27, notice we've gone from good, we've gone to bad, now we get worse. Verse 27 says, Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shean and its villages, or Tanakh and its villages, or the inhabitants of Dor and its villages, or the inhabitants of Iblim and its villages, or the inhabitants of Megiddo and its villages, for the Canaanites persisted in dwelling in the land. When Israel grew strong, they put the Canaanites to forced labor, but they did not drive them out completely. And we see the same theme over and over again. Notice, I'm not going to read every single word here, but verse 29, it goes tribe by tribe. Verse 27, it was Manasseh. Verse 29, and Ephraim did not drive out the Canaanites who lived in Gezer. In verse 30, Zebulun did not drive out the inhabitants of Kitron. Verse 31, Asher did not drive out the inhabitants of Akko. 33, Naphtali did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh. Notice, all of these tribes failed to do what they were told to do. They did not drive them out. Their failure now is being placed front and center. It's the first thing we learn about these tribes. The Canaanites are left in the land to dwell amongst the people. And now what is going to happen with those Canaanites living amongst the people? They're going to influence the people. They're going to influence how they think, how they act, how they worship, ultimately who they worship. This is going to be a great problem for Israel. In fact, this is why God said, you shall not let them remain in the land, because they will pull your hearts away from me. Well, we get to the worst part of this in verse 34. It says, the Amorites pressed the people of Dan back into the hill country, for they did not allow them to come down to the plain. The Amorites persisted in dwelling in Mount Perez and Aijalon and in Shalbim, but the hand of the house of Joseph rested heavily on them, and they became subject to forced labor. And the border of the Amorites ran from the ascent of Akrabim from Selah and upward. Now notice, all these other tribes said that they did not drive them out. They did not drive them out. They did not drive them out. But when we get to verse 34, it says the Amorites pressed the people of Dan back. Who's doing the driving here? It's the Amorites, the Canaanites. Dan is being driven. So this is the worst of the situation. So we've gone from good to bad to worst to worst. This is the worst of the situation here. And so when we get to chapter 2, we get a commentary from the angel of the Lord on this whole situation. Now the angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochim, and he said, I brought you up from Egypt, and I brought you into the land that I swore to give to your fathers. I said, I will never break my covenant with you, and you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall break down their altars, but you have not obeyed my voice. What is this that you have done? So now I say, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall become thorns in your sides, and their God shall be a snare to you. As soon as the angel of the Lord spoke these words to all the people of Israel, the people lifted up their voices and wept, and they called the name of that place Bochim, and they sacrificed there to the Lord. The name Bochim means weepers, because they lifted up their voices and wept. And so we get commentary right from the mouth of the Lord that what you have done, you have failed. You have gone against what I have told you to do. This comes right from the end of Joshua, Joshua chapter 23, where Joshua is telling the people, this is what you are to do once I am gone. We read these words, chapter 23, verses 12 and 13. It says, "For if you turn back and cling to the remnant of these nations remaining among you and make marriages with them, so that you associate with them and they with you, know for certain that the Lord your God will no longer drive out these nations before you, but they shall be a snare and a trap for you, a whip on your sides and thorns in your eyes, until you perish off this good ground that the Lord your God has given you." And this is exactly what the angel of the Lord has said. Verse 3, "So now I say, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall become thorns in your sides, and their gods shall be a snare to you." What they had been warned about in Joshua has come to fruition here in Judges. And the people wept and called the place the city of weepers, or the place of weepers. I just want to make a couple observations here as we read this together. First, this was a time of transition for Israel. We've already talked about this. We've gone from Moses to Joshua, and now from Joshua to whatever comes next. But there's something that Israel has to learn here. And it's a lesson that we have to learn as well. That it's not the human leader that's important. It's the fact that the Lord was with them that was important. And the Lord had not stopped being with them after Joshua, but they stopped obeying the Lord. It's a lesson for us because when we look back historically at the Christian church and Christian history, God has raised up wonderful leaders over the history of Christianity. Men like Augustine and Luther and Calvin. And we could even look at our own era, and we can look to guys like MacArthur and Piper and Keller and others that we say, these are wonderful leaders. And maybe sometimes we even step back and we say, what's it going to be like after MacArthur's gone? I'm sure previous generations thought, what's it going to be like when Billy Graham's no longer around? Or whatever the guy's name is. What's it going to be like when Stanley isn't around anymore? Or whoever it is. How are we going to survive that? As much as the Lord has used these men, let us not forget that it's not the men that we follow. It's the Lord that we follow. And God will raise up other men. And we will continue to follow the Lord regardless who the leaders are that we like to listen to or follow. It's the same for pastors in churches. You might think of a large presence and you wonder, well, how will they ever replace him when he's gone? Well, if the church fails when the pastor is gone, then the church is following the wrong leader. It's the Lord who leads. It's the Lord that we follow. So the church needs to understand, Israel needed to understand that we follow no man or woman. We follow the Lord. Pastors will come and go, but the Lord is forever. The Israelites also, second thing that we need to understand here is the Israelites failed to remove the Canaanites from the land, and ultimately they would be led astray by those Canaanites if they left them alone. And as we think about what that looks like for Israel and the historical significance of that for them and actual Canaanites living in the land, we don't have Canaanites that we are supposed to drive out of our land, but we do have things in our lives that God says we should not have in our lives, that we should remove those things from our lives. And we have to admit that sometimes we just settle. We might for a time be kind of excited, or we might be strongly active in removing things that cause temptation from ourselves, or those people who maybe are problematic in our lives that lead us astray, because we all can be led astray by peer pressure or just being part of certain groups of people. So we need to cut things out of our lives lives that pull us away from the Lord. But while sometimes we get excited about that and we might do it, other times we get settled in and we just kind of say, well, that's good enough. And we allow these other things to remain. And over time, those things pull us away also. So what is it in our lives? What sin is it? What influence is it? What is influencing us and continuing to pull us away from the Lord that we're failing to remove from our lives? Just as Israel allowed the Canaanites to stay in the land. Why did the Israelites fail? That's something to think about. Why did they fail? Well, part of it's probably fear. They had chariots of iron. We're scared of them. So certainly fear could be a part of it. Contentment. We're pretty happy with the way things are right here. We're happy with that. We're just going to leave it that way. Or they just didn't care, maybe. Yeah, that's what God said, but I don't care about that. All these things are the same reasons that we tend to fail. We're afraid. I don't want to look silly in front of other people. If I get too holy, I will look funny. I don't want to look funny when I tell my friends I can't do this or that, or when I tell my coworkers I can't do this or that because I don't partake in those kinds of things. I'm afraid of what that will look like for me. You can become content. Again, well, I'm happy with where I'm at. I feel like I've done enough. I'm better than most people. I'm better than that person for sure. So I'm content with where I'm at. Or again, we just don't care. I like what I like, and I'm just going to do it. And so we have multiple reasons why we fail. The last thing, though, is this, and this is something that's an overarching theme in the book of Judges as well. We always have to see that God is the hero. The Bible is a book about God, not man. So as we read the book of Judges and we see all of these flaws in the nation and in these individual judges who will be raised up, understand, these judges will be as flawed as the nation. But as we read, and we read their flaws, understand, God is an amazing God of grace. And so even in the midst of all the flaws, we see things being accomplished by God to his glory. Thankfully, he does the same with us. Because there's not a one of us sitting here that's not deeply flawed. But by God's grace, he uses us for his glory. Thankfully, he does that. And so this morning, I just want to challenge us. Have we become content? Have we settled in the land with influences that shouldn't be there? What do we need to work on in our own lives? But also, we praise God for his grace, that he uses sinners like us to accomplish his purpose. Let's pray together. Father, we thank you. We thank you for your word. We thank you for who you are and all you've done. We especially thank you for our Savior, who has paid for our sins and has reconciled us to you. Lord, we're thankful that you use sinners like us for your purposes, that you continue to work in our lives to sanctify us. And Lord, we know that one day we will stand before you holy and complete in Christ. We look forward to that day. And we thank you, Lord, by your